Thank you, Bill, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to be here, and thank you for all of you. It's really been a joy and a privilege to be a part of this event, and I'm grateful to get to spend a little bit of time reflecting on some of, I think, some of the bigger picture questions that this conversation opens. So the yes in God's backyard policies that are going to be the topic of the next panel, the panel following this, are one phenomenon that signal a broad public interest in the capacity of faith-based organizations to solve the housing crisis. And while these policies and while our conversation today are motivated by the specific instance, the particular characteristics of faith-based property, I think they raise broader questions about land use policy and financial mechanisms that produce or don't produce housing in this country. And I think these are questions that are intrinsically worth opening and asking. And that's where I want to spend our time today. What's most interesting to me about these kinds of policies, as well as conversations like our conversation today, is that even beyond faith communities' longstanding traditions of serving those in severe need, these policies and these conversations also seem to foreground faith-based actors as uniquely capable of overcoming systemic barriers to provision of any kind of housing in this country. What I want to explore today is the idea that, thus, as one attempt to overcome these systemic barriers to housing, the Yigby moment, we might call it, of foregrounding religious actors in housing provision falls short of its full potential if it fails to open up a deeper and broader societal conversation around those barriers and around the cultural and even spiritual significance of the fact that faith-based organizations seem so well placed to overcome them. In other words, I think this moment invites what we Catholics would call an examination of conscience for society as a whole when it comes to housing. So I want to open up this invitation in three ways. First, super briefly, we'll take a quick glance at the long history of the involvement of faith-based actors in housing provision. And much of this has already been covered much better earlier today, so we'll really do that very briefly. Second, I'll just sketch some of the key facts that are pushing faith-based organizations to the forefront here. You can probably guess what some of those are, but I just want to make the case that this is happening around the country. And finally, I really want to dive into that question of what this moment really means and how that deeper meaning can inform the concrete questions we're all gathered here to discuss. So first, a glance at the history. What is new about this moment and what isn't? Quite simply, faith-based organizations in the US have a long history of helping to provide shelter, both independently and in cooperation with various levels of government. Going back to the colonial era, Roman Catholic religious orders commonly established orphanages and residences for other vulnerable populations. In the 20th century, clergy like Monsignor John O'Grady were involved as advocates in some of the earliest public housing projects. Religiously motivated efforts like the YMCA, which reached the US in the 1850s, or the progressive settlement house movement in the early 1900s, both combined flexible, low-barrier housing with access to cultural, educational, and recreational resources to promote the dignity of disenfranchised city dwellers. Again, we heard from community development corporations today, founded in the 70s and 80s, that responded to the particular struggles brought about by financial policies and financial federal policies that promoted the development of the suburbs and disinvestment in the urban core. Today, among many others, Catholic Charities, Mercy Housing are among some of the biggest affordable housing providers in the country, including here in New York. So in sum, people of faith have long worked to provide shelter out of concern for justice, charity, and the dignity of all people. And they've done so under a wide array of social and economic conditions. The ways in which many of them are moved to do so today are informed by two key factors that help us understand, I think, what is distinctive about the moment we're responding to. The first, as I started to mention, is urban policy. So already beginning many, many decades ago, zoning ordinances implemented since the heyday of the American progressive movement have made many of the forms of supportive housing that religious groups traditionally and kind of in an ad hoc fashion offered, have made many of those illegal in most places. So simply continuing to offer, say, that single room occupancy model that a previous generation offered isn't feasible for some faith communities. More broadly, a wide array of both land use and financial policies implemented throughout the 20th century have radically restructured the American housing sector. Again, people in this room would be able to tell that story better than I can. But in some, many of those policies have made it harder not only for the very poor to find shelter, but for all but the most affluent to secure a stable home in many cities. Faith communities feel called now not only to support, say, children who have lost their parents or single young men flocking to the city for work, but individuals and families across a much wider range of socioeconomic conditions. Both the needs that faith communities feel called to respond to and the means available to them to meet those needs have changed. Second, of course, faith communities themselves have experienced change, not unrelated to those urban policies I mentioned, but compounded by broader social trends of disaffiliation and secularization. Many religious traditions have seen declining attendance, especially in the past 30 years. And I don't need to cite those statistics for this group, but just to take the case of the Roman Catholic Church, vocations to religious life and the priesthood dropped dramatically from peaks in the 1960s and 70s, with the number of religious sisters, for example, dropping from about 180,000 in 1965 to 40,000 today. So this is translated into a severe underutilization of thousands of religious properties located in both urban and rural areas, especially in the Northeast and the Midwest. Although I will note, even such a mainstream publication as Vox has picked up on the trend that maybe the generation younger than me, Gen Z, is even starting to be more interested in religion, so let's keep an eye on those statistics. So the specific strategy of repurposing these disused religious properties into housing does have some history, both sort of organically, just as redevelopments, as faith communities have exited markets, but also, again, Catholic organizations that have had a long tradition of having specifically residential buildings, say, because they had an orphanage back in the 1800s. There is somewhat of a history of repurposing those, but certainly this has reached a new cultural tipping point, as evidenced in part by these new policies that'll be discussed later. So in addition to Senator Brown's proposed federal bill, at least 10 different states have formally passed or proposed a statewide Yes in God's Backyard bill to make it easier for faith communities to build on their land, and numerous county and city level initiatives are in operation. Studies at UC Berkeley's Turner Center for Housing Innovation, NYU's Furman Center here in New York, have modeled the potential development across statewide on faith-based property, and the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy has started a similar study as part of its Who Owns America project. Our Notre Dame's Church Properties Initiative, of course, only exists because a critical mass of our stakeholders insisted that this was a key issue for our real estate institute to focus on. So why do I highlight all of these? I think a big part of what makes this moment distinctive just is this broad public conversation. Our secular, political, and university communities have taken notice of what's going on here and are laying some stakes on religious actors. They're noticing their situations, their potential, paying attention to what happens to them. And this is where I want to ask that deeper question of what this means. As I stated at the outset, what's interesting to me about these policies, most of them, is that, at least as an urban planner, as I read them, they seem to be framing faith communities as having this particular power, not only because they're interested in developing affordable housing, but a particular power to overcome some of these systemic barriers to housing production. What do I mean? So we've already touched on what some of those barriers to housing provision are. They include a lack of undeveloped land in residentially desirable areas, a financialized housing sector whose economic mechanisms seem locked in cycles of increasing unaffordability, and local politics that limit new development, both through restrictive zoning regimes and through sometimes prohibitive public consultation processes. So why do YIGB laws frame faith-based organizations as key protagonists? They take as their starting point, of course, that the demonstrated reality that worshiping congregations hold significant developable property, which solves the first problem. They assume that faith-based organizations don't have the profit motives that maybe stymie affordable housing provision elsewhere, so that overcomes the second. And then finally, they rely on the social capital that worshiping congregations have to make it politically feasible to grant them exemptions from the prohibitive regulatory regimes, thus solving the third. But This seems very neat, very logical, but I don't think it's the whole story. I think it's worth asking on a deeper level, what is it about worship or the way we treat worship that makes us expect the spaces that it occupies to somehow escape the deterministic laws that are squeezing out housing affordability elsewhere? I think the lack of a profit motive doesn't do all the work, right? Faith-based organizations still have tremendous financial responsibilities, and nobody, even the best intentioned, can actually produce housing for free, as we saw in the last panel. Sometimes cynically, I wonder if the hype really is just about cashing in on land that hasn't been developed, that's been temporarily held in reserve, and that in 40 years or so, when all the houses of worship have been developed into housing, we'll look around, we'll find that the situation is quantitatively altered, but qualitatively unchanged. And we find ourselves in a similar position down the road. But in a mode of faith, again, I think it is worth asking this deeper question: do faith communities really possess a different, perhaps essentially religious way of relating to land that changes the equation here? If they do, and if that's part of the promise of the Yigby moment, what lessons is broader society drawing from this discovery? Is this encounter with the potential of houses of worship to solve the housing crisis edifying for society at large? Or are we just cashing in on a one-time supply of cultural and economic chips in exchange for a one-time infusion of housing? I don't think this conversation is only about religious property per se, but also about what religion has to say about property. Again, I don't just mean because religious communities have charitable missions. Certainly there are aspects of this situation that only can be motivated by a religious commitment. You know, setting aside a glorious property like this one for the worship of God, that's clearly motivated by a religious commitment. Certain dramatic acts of charity or surrender of worldly goods, those are religious actions. But I think most of the people in this room would agree that we're not only talking about a matter of charity, but a matter of justice. Justice is a natural human value. It's evident to reason, not just revelation. And to get even a little bit more Catholic here for a second, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century said that grace does not replace or destroy nature, it perfects nature. So the church's mission, in addition to conveying a divine message about the supernatural means of salvation, is also to illuminate and hold up natural human values when they're obscured or forgotten. Understanding these commitments to justice as universally binding and not specifically religious, I don't think undermines the specificity of religious convictions at all. I think it helps them stand out more sharply. Otherwise, I actually think the Yigby moment risks backfiring. Securing the conditions in which the need for housing can be consistently met isn't only a matter of charity, a voluntary project operating on an opt-in basis. It's a grave matter of justice and of public civic responsibility. Religious communities may be essential to solving the housing crisis, but without a broader cultural, dare I say, conversion, their efforts will not be more than a voice crying in the wilderness. Powerful, but if ignored, damning. So, what is the nature of this wake-up call? I'll just touch on these briefly. Again, I think this is maybe just sort of a framing for a lot of the themes that we're talking about today. But the first has to do with development regulations, and the second with financing. But in general, I think faith communities have an opportunity to demonstrate what's possible when a society treats land and buildings primarily as a means to meet human need and as an arena for personal and communal development. This is a direct challenge to policies and practices that treat land and buildings primarily as investment assets, whether indirectly through exclusionary zoning policies that outlaw growth in the name of protecting incumbents' property values on the household level, or directly through financial structures that reduce homes to assets backing tradable and increasingly derivative investment instruments. Although, of course, both kinds of policies and practices have a role to play in this ecosystem. Their effects have often militated against affordability. So first, the challenge to how we regulate development. A majority of the Yigby policies don't focus on subsidy dollars, the kind of the traditional instruments used for implementing social policy. They really just adjust the knobs and levers of the normal development regulation process. Talking about permitted uses, heightened bulk limitations, parking requirements, the development review process. In other words, they're mostly about ways that we've decided to restrict housing in general. Barriers to housing that housing advocates and zoning reformers across the country have been taking aim at for decades. So the point I want to make here is that faith communities, with their vast developable land and their community goodwill, have given a pre-existing zoning reform movement a new opening. And I think it would behoove both the faith communities and zoning reform advocates to recognize that they're allies in a broader cultural project, that this isn't just about making it easier for faith properties to be redeveloped, but thinking about whether we can really afford to restrict development in the ways that we typically do everywhere. Second, if religious communities can be some kind of silver bullet to break through land use policies that have stifled equitable urban development since the Second World War, can they do the same for the distortionary financial incentives that have driven up housing prices beyond a sustainable level? And I'm obviously gesturing here at a much broader conversation that would be really interesting to have with more folks in this room about exactly how different policies have achieved their goals of making, say, homeownership more attainable, and how some have made that actually further out of reach. But this is a question that the people in this room are uniquely placed to pursue. And the finance professionals in this room in particular are here precisely because you realize the power that capital has, not only to directly meet material needs, but to empower individuals and communities to realize their potential. You know that access to capital is access to power and freedom and agency. Access to the space in which individuals and communities can realize the potential that they've brought with them into the world. Catholic social teaching refers to this as a self-developmental approach to understanding property. I think that language is helpful. There are investment and lending practices that multiply, spread, and enhance this power of personal and communal development, and strategies that instead lead to greater wealth concentration and disempowerment. The Federal Reserve and the SEC, important as they are probably not going to completely help you disentangle which strategies are which. But I think the example of the faith communities in this room can do that. To conclude, St. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century said, "The church is the world reconciled." Communities brought together by shared reverence for God, and therefore of respect for the human person and respect for creation as a gift from God intended to promote human flourishing, can model a different way of relating to property. They can model what a human-centered economy looks like, one where economic activity is coordinated towards meeting human needs and realizing human capacities, where metrics like efficiency and profit are signals and means towards these ends, never ends in themselves. Affordable housing development, social enterprise, faith-based community development, and the many paths of restoration or adaptive reuse of currently underused religious properties can all be ways in which communities of faith live out their missions of reconciling the world with God and different parts of the world with each other. Partnering with them invites the world of real estate development and investment into a renewed encounter with its own deepest purpose, meeting human need and realizing human potential. I hope our society takes up this invitation to the full. Thank you.